Welcome to Decoding Leadership, where we break down the elements of humane and effective leadership. I'm your host, Jade Rubik. Welcome to the show, Brent. I would love to start with talking about Upscale. You and I went through this project called Upscale at New Relic many years ago, and I think it's a very compelling story. And so I was wondering if you could set the stage and tell us the story of Upscale.
Yeah, happy to. First, thanks for having me on the show. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's really fun, especially because Upscale is sort of the best of times and worst of times. And it's nice to put myself back in that headspace. So, to set the stage a little bit, so we were at New Relic, a very successful startup, and we had been scaling rapidly and doing pretty well on that. And from where I was sitting, I was an engineer on the team that handled the big Rails monolith that we had. And there was just endless amounts of work, as you would expect. And we were doing good stuff, and the company was launching new product lines, and it just felt like everything was working really well. I think it's ironic that you're asking me to set the stage because from where I'm sitting, you actually started it. Because at the time, you were in a leadership position, like you were a manager. Maybe you'd gotten to director by then, I think. Um,
I think I was a director at that point.
it's sitting in
Yeah.
leadership. I can tell the story, right? So, sitting in leadership, you noticed that we were having a hard time getting projects done. And so you brought in Jim Shore, who's a local agilist, very well known and very good at what he does. And you brought him in to help us out. And so he kicked off this big project that we eventually called Upscale. From where I was sitting on my team, I think we really had all the problems and just didn't know it. So from where I was sitting, there was always more work to be done. And we were like really helping all the other teams work on the monolith. And we had our own projects. And we had 5 engineers and 7 projects in flight.
Wow.
And realistically, I had a project of my very own, my little baby, I was working on it, and 2 of the engineers were pairing on a project. So we had 7 projects in flight, but we were only working on 3 of them. And so that meant for us, like, we were always busy, but from a leadership perspective, we were in a really bad spot because leaders kept asking for more stuff to get done and nothing was happening. And so we had what we later described as institutional gridlock, right? The organization was just stuck. We had a lot of teams waiting for other teams to do work. And those teams were waiting for other teams to do work. We're waiting for the first set of teams to do work. And everybody was waiting for everybody else to do work. And nothing was happening. And this problem was especially bad for our site engineering group because a lot of the projects needed site engineering support. And so all the work just collided on those teams and they just could not get it all done. It was way more than they were able to do. And I think on top of that, we had some unclear prioritization. And then we had like a CEO fast lane with all the bad problems that that produces, where the CEO would just like reach into the org and be like, hey, 3 engineers, I want your help on this thing right now. Just come help me, please. And those 3 engineers were all of a sudden not working on what their team had committed to, but nobody could say no because it was the CEO. And he would often pick, I mean, very wisely or maybe unwisely, the very best engineers. So he would cherry pick the 3 best. And then those teams would really be at a loss because they had lost not just their best engineer, but one of the best engineers in the org. And so that CEO fast lane was a response to everything being slow, and it made everything slower. So it created this real negative spiral. And that was the situation that we were in when Jim Shore found us. So I think
Yeah.
that sort of sets the stage where we were as an org. Is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah. It's funny. When I actually brought in Jim Shore, I was interviewing him for a manager position, and Ward Cunningham had recommended him.
Mm,
And you turned that very cleverly into a consulting role. But one of the things we talked about was what we called the cross team project problem. And it was like small things could still sometimes work, but like anything that crossed a team's boundaries, it just, it was inevitable that it would go off the rails. And so that's really what we brought him in to help us solve was the cross team project problem. It felt like it was impossible to get those projects done. And yeah, so came in and he created the Upscale group, and you and I were both a part of that.
As a little bit of context, the way he formed the group, I think, was very important to how the group was able to succeed. And what he did, which was super clever, is he asked everybody in the org, we're going to do this thing and we're going to have a tiger team. And who do you trust to represent you on the tiger team?
Which was brilliant. It was such a
It
nice way
was
to do it.
so smart, just
Yeah,
so smart. And what we ended up with was a list of the people who the organization trusted to get work done.
yeah.
And that meant that we were starting with an advantage because usually when you announce to an organization, we're planning a big reorg, everything goes off the rails, right? Because like all of a sudden
Yeah.
people are like worried they're going to lose their jobs. They're worried about the unknown that's going to happen. And we dealt with a lot of that. But if you just say we're going to do it without any of that trust, it just increases the gap between the ICs and the leaders. If the ICs already have a reason to not trust the leadership, making that announcement is not going to help, right? And so when we started with this tiger team, the upscale team that was already in a good spot. And so at the beginning of the work, a lot of what we did was defining our constituencies within the organization. So it was not just functional groups like the designers and site eng and the UI engineers, but there was also some groups like the engineers in San Francisco. We're going to have different needs than the engineers in Portland. And so we defined all the constituencies that we could find, mapped those out to the people on the upscale team so that we could reach out to them and be like, hey, I'm your rep in this process. You got any questions, you can come to me. As we learn stuff and as we make progress, I will be talking to you. And so we created these channels that were between all the people in the organization and this trusted group of individuals that bypassed any sort of leadership interference if there was going to be any, or if there was any concerns that there would be any.
That was a really brilliant way of doing it. I forgot about that.
There was so much that we did. We were working on it for 6+ months, right? It took us a
Yeah.
long time. So we started with that. And then I think the next big round of work, and there were multiple waves of this, but the next big round of work was to, it wasn't to understand the problem. That's what we told people we were doing, is we're trying to understand the problem.
Yeah.
But the work was really, looking back at it now with the change management training in my head that I got long after Upscale, all of it
Yeah.
was change management work. And
Yeah.
we did a bunch of work to convince people that what Jim had already diagnosed as the problem was in fact the problem.
Yes.
And looking back at it, I really truly believe that most of that work was not for the rank and file. It was to convince the leaders that this was the problem.
It was funny because it seemed like discovery work, and the way like anybody that saw all the artifacts, they would have been like, "Oh, this is really we're getting down to the heart of things." But it really was alignment work. It was to get everybody on the same page about the problem that Jim had already figured out probably on day 1. Yeah.
Yes. And what Jim did is before he signed the contract, he talked to every team, figured out what was going on, and then used that to define the scope of work. So the leaders had a contract that they thought was going to get what they wanted and that he knew he could achieve. And that was because he already had done the diagnosis. But he'd already done it. And then he took us through that diagnosis process again as a full organization. And to give the listeners a sense for what that work looked like, a lot of it was we're going to get a bunch of people in a room and talk to them about what's going on and get them to produce some artifacts that tell us what's happening. So I think my favorite activity of all of them was when we put together the dependency diagram.
Oh my
So
god.
we spent, that was a whole afternoon. It was a good 4 to 5 hours in the big break room up in Milliways. And I think we had about 50 people in the room to do that. We asked every team, give us somebody.
Mhm.
And we asked people, for your team to get work done, who do you need to do work for you? And so everybody produced their little list of notes. And then we had the whole group put together a chart with a card for every team. And we like stuck them on giant sheets of butcher paper and draw the lines to all the other teams. And we started with people arranging them and trying to see, can we even make this diagram work, and moving stuff around. And then we're like, okay, stick them down, draw the lines. And so that chart in the end, I think it was an 8-foot wide roll of paper, and the artifact was about 20 feet long. and it looked like the flying spaghetti monster threw up. That's just what it looked like. It was just massive lines with these meatballs called teams, right? That were the note cards that were on there. And that was the kind of work that we did. It was a lot of this sort of discovery work to really understand what is happening here. So that told us about the dependencies. We traced a couple of projects to the value stream map for those projects to really show here's when work is happening on the projects, and look, here's when work is not happening on the projects. That exercise told us that uh, despite having all the cross team dependency problems, we were actually managing to get work done every week on every project that was in flight.
Hmm.
And that was really surprising. And as I recall, Jim was like, I'm impressed because it's so unusual for that to happen, even in a highly functioning organization. It
Mm.
spoke a lot, I think, to the culture we had around the engineering practices, not necessarily the leadership practices, but the actual like fingers on keyboards practices that were able to keep things moving despite having so much blockage in the system. I think it was also a little bit of a kudos moment for some of the kind of lower level leadership, the line managers and some of the directors who were able to make stuff happen
Hmm.
despite all the problems. And so we came out of all of that discovery knowing why we were so jammed up. And the punchline is because we were trying to do too much at once.
Yeah.
And knowing how the org was responding to that and seeing that our team structures were not aligning to the work that we needed to be done.
Yeah.
We had a bunch of teams that were more functional teams, a sort of a front end team and a back end team, which meant that any
Hmm.
completed work had to work across both teams. So, in a sense, we designed our org to have related functions grouped together so that those individuals could share best practices, put all the UI engineers in a box, and then you'll get better UI out of it. And I believe that's true. But also that maximized the cross team dependencies that we had. And so it
Yeah.
made it harder for any one stream of work to ever complete. So we were in this kind of interesting situation. Some of our structure was really working for us, some of it was really not. And then we had all these artifacts that we could then take to the senior leadership and say, here's what's going on. And these were conversations I was never privy to because Jim did them. But the sense I have is those conversations were like, here's where we are, here's what's wrong, here's what we need to do, and here's what you're going to have to change in order for you to get what you want. And so I think a lot of those conversations really training leadership about here's what's coming for you. It was very personal and hands-on change management.
Yeah.
I found that very fascinating. So I think that's how that kind of middle of the work went. It was a lot of that fake discovery to really confirm the diagnosis, but also to make it obvious and inarguable. So
Yeah.
nobody could say, I don't believe we've got a cross team dependency problem. Look, here's the picture.
And I remember even at the time feeling impatient with the whole process. I felt like it took a long
Mm,
time. It seemed laborious.
yeah.
And I remember looking back on it and being like, ah, there was so much wasted time there. But I actually think that it was some of the best change management I've ever seen. It was incredibly successful. And it's not to say
Agreed.
it wasn't without a lot of friction, a lot of stress. These type of large scale changes are usually not successful. It's almost a cliche to say like an agile transformation. Haha, that's going to
Oh,
not go
yeah.
well or it'll be so so. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about like where it ended up and what were the kind of changes and what were some of the results because I think they were totally fascinating.
Oh, yeah. Once we did all that discovery, then we got into all of the planning exercises, which I thought were really fascinating. And again, I feel like Jim did a really excellent job not giving us the answer, but getting us to invent the answer ourselves.
Yeah.
And so I like one of the activities we went through, I remember we had, it was maybe 25 or 30 people. Again, we're up in Milliways in the break room. And we were talking about what might the org design look like. And so we gave everybody a series of prompts and had them like draw the best org structure you can for this prompt. And so one of the prompts was if we're optimizing for CEO happiness, what does it look like?
Oh yeah, I remember
Right.
that. That was fun.
Versus if we're optimizing for not having enough designers, what does it look like?
Yeah.
Or if we're optimizing for engineering throughput, what does it look like?
Yeah.
And so we took a bunch of these charts and then we like looked at all the charts together and looked at here's what we like and what we don't like about them. And clearly we're not going to optimize for CEO happiness. It's a terrible plan for the company. But we can't throw out everything that we learned from doing that, because if we make a structure where the CEO is unhappy,
Yeah.
we're all in trouble, right?
Yeah.
It was a very interesting exercise. And so what we wanted to do was to really rework the structure of the team so that we didn't have projects crossing team boundaries in order to cross the finish line. We wanted to
Mhm.
design a system of teams where every team had everything that they needed locally within their own domain, as much as reasonably possible, to complete a project.
Yeah.
So that meant going from the front end and the back end of a particular product being on two separate teams to saying, okay, we're going to make 3 teams here. One team will own this bucket of features front to back. Second team, this bucket of features front to back. Third team, this bucket of features front to back. So we set that up, and then we ran into all of the challenges that were caused by the constraints we had going in. And the primary constraint was no headcount changes. So neither up nor down.
Yeah.
And that meant that if we wanted to put a designer on every team and we didn't have enough designers for every team, which was the situation we were in, we're going to have to figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
And that was problematic for us with the design team. We didn't have enough people to go around. We also had teams that didn't need a full-time designer. Similarly, for product management, there were not nearly enough product managers to go around, but we needed product management everywhere. And I think that's one we want to drill into a little bit and talk about the TPMs. I feel like that was an interesting system.
Yeah.
Maybe let's just do that. Let's talk about the ideal team and we'll talk about how we made all the exceptions.
Sure.
Ideal team had, we called it the 3-legged stool. So every successful software engineering team, in order to get stuff done, needs engineering, product management, and design.
Mhm.
Without those 3 capabilities within the team, you are not going to be able to ship great software. And it was pretty easy for us to get engineers for every team. We had enough engineers
Mhm.
to go around. That
Mhm.
was easy. We did not have enough designers to go around, and we don't have enough product managers to go around. And so what we did is, the meeple exercise. Do you remember the meeples?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Let's talk about the meeple exercise. So as we were planning this, we did a bunch of work to figure out what were the teams going to be, not in terms of people, but what's the bucket and what's the feature space that bucket's going to hold.
Mhm.
So we created our lists of teams, and that was a very laborious exercise. It took us, I think we spent a few weeks on that, really kind of min-maxing the thing and trying to understand how are we going to best serve the product roadmap needs? How are we going to best serve the business needs? Like, how are we going to accommodate all those things? And then we got all the leaders in a room. We did this at a retreat, and we ordered little meeples. And for people who don't know what meeples are, this comes out of the board game world. If you've played a game like Settlers of Catan where there's little wooden people, those are meeples. So we ordered a bunch of meeples, one for every person in the org, and we color coded them by function. I forgot the colors were, it doesn't really matter, but there was like a color for engineering, a color for design, a color for product management, a color for engineering manager, which were all the main functions that we had. Not engineering manager, but just any kind of manager, I believe. And then we got all the leaders into a room. We put cards on tables. Actually, we put sheets on tables with a card for what we thought the team name might be. We put a list of what we thought the features that they were going to own might be. And we had the group right size the feature sets in every team based on our first draft. And then we put the meeples down on the tables. And that was a real interesting like moment of epic fail. What
Yeah.
we'd intended to do was to tell our chief product officer, here are all of the meeples. You get to allocate these to your direct reports in the new structure based on whatever you think the arrangement ought to be,
Yeah.
so that the chief product officer could do essentially the budgetary allocation
Yeah.
and say, I want to invest more in design or not design, but I want to invest more in site engineering. I don't want to invest more in product line 3. I want to invest more here. So they could figure that out. And then the notion was he would pass those on to his direct reports. They would look at their teams and their bucket of meeples and allocate to the next tier down. It would cascade down until we got to a director telling the line managers, you've got these 4 meeples. This is your team. We intended to do that, and we didn't quite do that. And so what happened was he said, okay, let's start putting the meeples down. And a couple of the really clever senior leaders just ran over to the table and scooped up as many meeples as they could to be like, my domain. And I feel like that was an epic fail, but it also was incredibly
Yeah.
revealing of, I think, the dynamics that occur in every organization.
Yeah.
Is that those senior leaders are really concerned, if I don't get the headcount that I need, I am not going to be able to succeed as a leader.
Mhm.
And so it turns into a me versus every other person at my level contest. And it
Yeah.
becomes antagonistic rather than
Yeah.
cooperative. And this
Yeah,
is
and it was
what I
one of the
believe. Go
go
ahead.
ahead. It was one of the few examples, I think, where those exercises didn't really work very well, and I think it was because it wasn't a problem-solving, like, optimization sort of thing. It was more of, like, it became a us and then, like, zero-sum game.
Yes. Here's my kind of mildly contrarian take on the world as it is.
Yeah.
And this is all ideas that have been refined since Upscale. I believe that the way we run organizations with the hierarchies, what we saw was an inevitable outcome of that structure.
I totally think so,
In
yeah.
in those hierarchies, it is inevitable that you will have leaders fighting against each other
Yeah.
because they are assessed based on their budgets. And if you've got a
Mhm.
bigger budget, you have more power.
Yeah.
And so we create a power struggle and we wonder why we have power struggles.
Yeah.
In other nudes, the leopard ate my face. And this is exactly the problem. And so it really became very clear in that moment with the meeple exercise that that's what we had going on.
Yeah.
I also thought it was very interesting that in the room at the time, the worst offenders of that were the newest senior leaders we had, the ones who were
Interesting.
least steeped in the culture that we had built.
Yeah, that makes sense, actually.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it was the people who came into the C suite or near the C suite from recent acquisitions were
Mhm.
the ones who did not have any trust yet that the organization's culture really was supportive and very
Yeah.
understanding. And they did not know that if they didn't run up to the table, that they were actually going to get what they needed.
Yeah.
So that was a very interesting kind of eye-opening moment. But I think the lesson took a few years to land for me from
Totally.
that one.
I think a
That was
lot of things with Upscale did. So when I think back, we did the team redesign, and that was focused around reducing dependencies. And we did a lot of team chartering and design, and but but a lot of it was around being very explicit about the ways that the teams interacted with each other. I thought that was super interesting. We created a kind of central prioritization scheme through the what we called the product council. That
Yep.
was also totally interesting and had a lot of success and failures. We put product managers on every team. We had a self-selection event where people decided which teams they wanted to be a part of, which is a huge topic, super interesting. And we
Yep.
also had added a mandate essentially that each team could only work on one project at a time and articulated a way to work more incrementally as we were delivering our projects. So it was a lot of changes at the same time. Which of those kind of leap out to you as topics you want to jump into?
Yes, all of them.
All of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they come in a couple clusters. The team redesign and the putting a product manager on every team and the product council. I feel like there's a great topic there around decision making. Our investigation on decision making turned up some very interesting pieces, including all the spots in the flow of decisions where the CEO could intervene,
Hmm.
which made our decision making process extraordinarily complex because there was always the risk that you might not be making a decision that would stand. And in fact, what we had pre Upscale was a system that did not encourage distributed decision making. We
Interesting.
had come out of a consensus driven culture and we'd managed to move that away from consensus to more of a culture of consent, but that still meant I still have to ask everybody if they consent or not.
Yeah.
And so we saw a lot of projects that would figure out their through line, make a really smart decision, and then spend months trying to get other people to agree. And that slows everything down. And not only is that project not getting done, but they're interrupting all these other teams to get decisions made.
Yeah.
So that was a real issue for us. And so I feel like that decision making domain is a really interesting one. So the new model that we moved to was one where we had this centralized product council, and that was essentially all of the VPs is a way to
Of
put it.
all the VPs of product, and I
It
think
was
there
product
was,
engine
like, our head
design.
architect and head of design. Yeah. I don't know
Um,
that the full there were like, engineering and design were as well represented as product, but yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe it was all of those functions completely.
yeah, they were all there. It was, yeah, it was everybody who was a VP essentially was in that room. It's
Mm.
just that there were far fewer VPs of design than there were
Okay.
VPs of engineering and product. So there was
Yeah.
like just the one
Yeah.
VP of design. So like he was in there. And yeah, as you say, the chief architect and a couple other kind of choice people were picked to be in that room. And the notion was that the product council would create the single prioritized list of org wide priorities.
Mhm.
So here are the projects. There was a lot of work that was done around forming those projects to be reasonable. So if your project is like, here's all the stuff we want to do, here's the resources we need, and we don't have those three teams on our schedule, or our project's not on their schedule, the product council would say, you don't have a project yet. And so they were very good about making sure that they were not committing to projects that didn't have the resource allocation that they needed.
Yeah.
And then so the product council would establish the list like that. And then the idea was every team in the organization would look at that list and say, can I contribute to the number one priority? If so, that's my work. And they would work on
Yeah.
that until they were done contributing to the top priority. Then they would go to the number two priority and so on down the list. And that, in principle, was a great idea. It was
Yeah.
teams pulling work, which is to say that teams are able to say no because
Mhm.
they don't have to say no anymore. They're not
Yeah.
denying requests for work. All they're doing is saying, here's our new top priority. This is what we're working on. And they would then announce that to the organization. And the reality was that the leader in charge of the number two priority couldn't get anything done because all the teams were getting vacuumed up by the number one priority. And so they couldn't get anything to happen. And
Yeah.
if you're that senior leader at the end of the year, you're going to go to your performance review and say, I got nothing done. Why not? Because I was the number two priority. And they're going to get fired for something that's not their fault. And in
Yeah.
fact, in the kind of hierarchies that we produce, leaders get rewarded for bucking how the system works to get their projects done. So the leader in charge of the number two priority and the leader in charge of number three and four and five and six priorities were working overtime to convince teams to work on their stuff, even though the teams should have been working on the number one priority.
Yeah.
And so
I
what we
I felt
had
like
was a prioritization system that looked good on paper and completely failed in the real world.
it worked in some respects and that it helped to rationalize a lot of the work, but that there were incentives for leaders to make stuff happen even if it wasn't the top priority. And so it was there was a way in which people didn't really follow the system as completely as they could. And I felt like a big part of the reason for that was there wasn't really any pressure on the top priorities to really keep their blast radius small. And in
Yeah.
fact, it was the opposite. There was a lot you really if you had the number one priority, it was like you rule engineering. You could do
You could get
anything
anything.
you want, and you can make the blow up the scope as much as you want. And there wasn't, I think, a much more desirable system would really incentivize and restrict the scope of the priorities so that things can flow further down into the priority list.
Yeah. And that's also a good idea from queuing theory perspective, right? If you're trying to fit a bunch of rocks through your queues, it's not going to work,
Yeah,
right? If you crush them down into pebbles, it'll be better. But if you make sand, that'll just going to flow through your system really easily.
yeah,
And we saw that not only from the senior leaders, but we also saw that from some of the more interesting teams, like the team that was working on our SSO offering. They had a massive migration that was going to require every team to do work for them. And they realized, because their product manager figured this out, that if he could say, we're a part of the number one priority, all of a sudden he could get every other team to do work for him. So not only were the leaders at the top encouraged to blow up the scope of their projects, because while you're in the number one slot, you might as well get it done. But the people on the ground who had their own priorities were also being like, if I can attach myself to that, If I
Yeah.
can hitch my wagon to that star, I will also win. And so
Yeah.
it set up a real winner take all kind of system. And there's a phenomenal book called The Cheating Culture that came out maybe 20 years ago now or something. And they talk
Yeah.
about why people cheat. And one of the hallmarks of a system that encourages cheating is winner take all stakes. And
Yeah.
so if you have winners take all systems like we did, you see a lot more cheating.
And another way of looking at it is if you there's the book Principles of Product Development Flow, and it talks about how batching tends to encourage more batching. And the larger your batch sizes, the more people will want to increase the batch sizes because you can't get your work done unless you're part of the big glob. That was definitely a challenge with the product council.
Yeah. And it sounds like we're dunking on the product council. To be totally honest, it was so much better than what we had before.
It was
Because
actually amazing. Yeah.
before the product council, we did not have a list of projects with priorities. It
Yeah.
was just a morass of every team's keeping their own list, and you do whatever your manager says and you're going to be fine. And the
Yeah.
managers were having to rationalize it all through a lot of back channel work. And so, although we're slamming it a little bit, I feel like it was revolutionary improvement of where we came from. It just was also completely insufficient to the task that we needed it to do.
Yeah, I agree. I think where it was really effective was it helped give people some ammunition to say no. And so, like, especially the teams that were on the receiving end of so many requests, they were able to say, look, we'd love to do that. And the number one priority is this. And we're going to do that before we can do this. And it also combined with some of the new way of being a little bit more explicit about how the teams work together, where a lot of the people that were running the projects, they basically learned that they couldn't count on their dependencies. You had to
Mhm.
make plans that didn't rely on other teams doing work for you unless there was some sort of mechanism in place to make them do work for you. And that
Yeah.
usually was the product council. And so that what that meant is a lot of our planning became a lot better and a lot more reasonable, I think.
Agreed. I think with the product council in place, we had a much better understanding of what was actually going on across the organization.
Yeah.
The prior system had encouraged a lot of work to go underground.
Yeah.
And the new system, we flushed a lot of that out of the tunnels, so to speak, and out into the light. And so I think it was overall really great. But
Yeah.
right. So let's talk about one of these other systems, one of the parts of the system, which is how the teams were telegraphing what they were working on. Let's talk about the MMFs. One of the problems we had pre-upscale was like my team with 5 engineers and 7 projects is a great example of it. Is we had 7 projects, which means every week our manager was reporting on 7 things, 4 of which were getting no progress. Seems like a lot of bureaucracy for things that are never going to get any progress to happen, right? And part of that was that in the older system, engineers tended to own code individually. Brent is the last person who worked on the CSS, so Brent owns the CSS. Got
Yeah.
CSS questions? Ask Brent.
Yeah.
And it was great for me to feel good about people asking me lots of questions about the site infrastructure that I'd built. And that was very wonderful for me and terrible for the organization. And
Yeah.
so what we moved to, and this was a very explicit decision in the new post upscale design, was individuals don't own work, teams own work.
Yeah.
And so that was a big part of our team design, was like, what is this team going to own, rather than Brent owns this and he changes teams and he takes it with him.
Yeah.
We had that notion of teams own work. And then when teams commit to work, they weren't committing to individual tickets, right? Since work is fractal, there are big projects we want to do, and then there's individual tickets. And in the middle, Jim introduced this notion of the minimal marketable feature, the MMF, we called it.
Yeah.
And that's not a term that he invented. And things that take this shape in lots of different systems. But it's this little thing that's like smaller than a project, but bigger than a ticket. So
Yeah.
we define the MMF as 1 to 3 weeks of work for a single team.
Yeah.
And the notion is that it's a slice of work that stands alone and does not depend on future work to deliver its value. So every MMF had to define a value statement. Here's the value we're going to produce for the company. If you think of how people typically build a lot of software, is we build it in the layer cake fashion. You build the lowest layer of your cake first. You get your database in order. Then the next layer, you build your modeling tier. Then the third layer, you build the UI. And so if you do
Yeah.
that as three MMFs, the first two MMFs are producing no value. You don't have anything that you can show anybody yet. By the
Yeah.
time you get to the third MMF and you've plumbed it through from the database into the UI, you can actually show it to a user and get feedback. But if you've got it wrong, you got to go redo all that work. And this is one of the fallacies of waterfall style planning, is that you can do it in these layers, get the architecture first, then get the design, then the database, and so on. And what we did is we tried to turn that around and say these MMFs are a vertical slice of work.
Hmm.
It's not necessarily a complete feature, but it works. And what it
Yeah.
does, you can see.
Yeah.
So on a bigger project, you might slice it into MMFs. And the first MMF might be do the research and produce a plan. What's the value statement? The value that we are producing for the organization is we now have a plan that we can try and execute on. We have an understanding of our dependencies, how many people it's going to take, how long it's going to take. Maybe we've done some prototyping work. We understand the hard problem is going to be really hard or not so hard. That's information that you can use. The audience is not the customers, the audience is the leaders.
Yeah.
Then from there, you might go to the first slice, which is we got to plumb this thing through from the database into the UI. It's not going to do anything yet, but we'll have a screen where you can see there's new object X exists. It doesn't do anything. But you can show it to people and say, hey, designers, is the information architecture on this correct? Are we in the right spot?
Hmm.
Maybe it's in the wrong product, even. Maybe it should be over there. Maybe it should be nested underneath that other feature that we've got. And so then you build progressively out more vertical slices. At the end of each MMF, the feature works, but it's not complete.
Hmm.
And as you're doing this, and one of the great things that this really enables is at the beginning of the project, when you're doing the planning, it's very hard to know what done is going to look like. But as you're getting closer, you can see it. And you can see, actually, if we don't do that chunk of work, we could ship now and then ship that chunk
Yeah.
of work later. So it
Yeah.
can be done earlier and then decide, do we do that chunk of work or do we defer till next year? And so having MMFs, what that meant was the oversight from up above, the teams, was not looking at tickets anymore. They were just
Hmm.
looking at the MMF. So they're looking at work in these 1 to 3 week resolution chunks.
Yeah.
And that is a pretty good scale to look at for a more senior leader.
Yeah.
Because if you're thinking about that team, if the average MMF is 2 weeks long, it means you have 26 decision points in a calendar year. That's really
Hmm.
good. If you're
Yeah.
working at the project level, you might have 2 decision points in a year, if you're lucky,
Yeah. And that's not
probably
enough.
one.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
not enough. And it's certainly not
Yeah.
agile, right? Agility is not what the consultants are selling you. Agility is the ability to make a new decision and change the direction it's going in and make that move relatively quickly. That's it. That's all agility really is.
Yeah.
And so this enables more agility because you have more decision points. Also, because the decision points are over smaller chunks of work, they're less risky.
Yeah.
If you're making one decision point a year and you make a bad decision, you lost a year.
You're screwed.
If your decision point is over 2 weeks and you make a bad decision, you've only lost 2 weeks. And it's
Yeah.
not great, but it's better than 52 weeks.
Yeah.
It's 26 times better, in fact. That's an order of magnitude improvement on the ability of leaders to get their agendas done. I feel like that whole system with the product council owning priorities, teams pulling the work and telegraphing their intents through their MMFs,
Yeah.
saying, here's my current MMF that I'm working on, here's the future intended roadmap, but it's not a commitment. It's just our idea for the future. I feel like that gave us a lot of possibilities. And I think we saw those benefits really rapidly after the rollout.
Yeah. This whole
Mhm.
process was incredibly disruptive. And the expectation was
Hugely.
engineering is going to totally not produce anything at all after we go through these changes. But that was really not the case. It actually
Yeah.
was quite the opposite.
The year before Upscale, and I think this is why you
Yes.
instigated this whole thing. You have to put yourselves back into where New Relic was, which was a big company. We'd have two big moments in the year. It was Velocity and AWS reInvent. Those were our two big
The
moments.
two big conferences for us. Yes.
And we will always wanted to announce, I think it was at AWS was the big announcement. I forget which one was which, doesn't really matter. But we would announce in April what we were planning on doing for the conference, which was in October. And so the
Mhm.
year before Upscale, we announced the laundry list of stuff. And there was always a couple of dozen items on it because there was enough teams and enough leaders involved that that's what came out. And as I recall, that the year before Upscale, of the big three, we got zero done, which was just a terrible situation for us to be in, right? And I think
Yeah.
that prompted some of the soul searching that then led you to bring in Jim Short. Then the year of Upscale, so we started working on it in the fall after the whiff on our conference, knowing that we were going to roll out the new system sometime in the spring, probably after we'd made the commitments for the fall.
Yes.
And we were going to have to do the organizational transformation, do all the change management, have everybody look around at the new world and be like, how the heck does this work? What am I doing even? Who am
Yeah.
I? What is my name? What's going on? Have to lead everybody through that and still produce enough work to land at the conference and have a good talk.
Yeah.
And so the punchline is we did the upscale kind of rollout, which culminates in the big self selection event. We did that, I believe it was in April or May. I think it was May.
Okay.
And then by October, we not only delivered all of the big items, but a couple of extras off that were not on the list. A
Yeah.
couple of teams got their stuff done early and we're like, we've had this thing in our backlog. It's an MMF in size. We're just going to pull that to the front and get it done. And in
Yeah.
fact, the insights team, I believe, shipped 2 extra features that they had not committed to above and beyond what they had committed to because the new way of working was so much more.
It's
From one
stunning,
year to the
actually.
next, we went from hitting 0 of the big 3 to hitting at least the top 10 plus extras, having spent all of the time and effort to do the transformation. It was just a mind-blowing result at the end.
It really shows just how much waste was built into our system at that point. Like, we were spinning our wheels so much. We were working so hard to get things
Yes.
done despite all the things that were set up against us. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was amazing.
It felt like salmon swimming upriver. And then
Yeah.
upscale came around and just took the dams out.
Let's go to self-selection.
When we got to planning the rollout, at this point, we've got our list of teams and the desired headcounts.
Mhm.
So we've been through that exercise. We've figured that out. We've right sized what all the teams ought to own or what we think they ought to own. And then what we decided to do, and this was a bit of an impulse decision, as I recall, was like,
Mhm.
instead of having the VP sit in a back room and decide everybody's fate, what if we
Yeah.
do it with them and have everybody decide for themselves where they're going to go?
I think Jim had done it once before, and he basically pitched it to the chief product officer, and he went for it, and it
Yes.
terrified all of us.
Oh, yes. And
Yeah.
not just those of us on the upskill team, but when we announced it to the org, it terrified the entire organization. At that point, we were doing these weekly town halls about what was going on in upscale land, and they were pretty well attended. And we had a couple engineers in particular who were very good at asking the hard questions that everybody else was too ashamed or embarrassed or afraid to ask. I'm thinking of one in particular, and I'm so glad that they were there to do that work. And when we first announced it, I mean, you could have heard a pin drop in the room. People were like, what do you mean? What is exactly going on here? We had to be very
Yeah.
clear to reiterate, no headcount changes. You're not going to lose your job. Your role might change,
Yeah.
but if it changes, it's because you want it.
Yeah.
And we're not going to force anybody into doing anything.
Mhm.
That last bit was a little bit of a lie. We'll talk about that in a second. But what we did to prepare for everybody to select onto their teams was we decided to essentially have a job fair.
Mhm.
And in order to have a job fair, we needed to have somebody on every team to say, come join my team. Here's what the team's going to be like. So what we did was in advance, we assigned the managers to the teams
Mhm.
and we assigned the product managers to the teams.
Yeah.
They did not get a choice.
Yeah. And there were a few engineers that were also, like, they were anchored to the teams too, weren't there?
Yeah, there are 2 flavors. So for teams
Yeah.
where they were a team that was internally facing, their customers were the other engineering teams. So teams like the site engineering teams, for example, we didn't have enough product managers to go around. So we asked those teams to have what we called a TPM, a technical product manager, who was an
Right.
engineer who was going to roughly half time do the work of the PM.
Yeah.
So there was those folks. And then there were also some mission critical systems, things like our data ingest here, very high volume, very delicate because of the high volume. And we know there's some, we need people to babysit this thing all the time. So we can't have all of those engineers just leave it.
Yeah.
So we also appointed, and we asked these people if they were willing, but it was a real strong arm and ask, right?
Yeah.
So we asked them if they were, we asked these engineers, are you willing to be what we call the continuity engineer and
Yeah.
stay with this software? So
Yeah.
the software might have been moving to a new team, or the team structures might have been blown up, but they moved with it and they did not get a choice for where they went. They stayed with their very mission critical software. So there was a handful of those. I remember
There weren't
less
that
than
many.
20 continuity engineers, but we did have quite a bit of TPMs in the mix.
Hmm.
I think the TPMs was maybe closer to 30 people. It was a fair bit.
Yeah.
And so then we organized the big job fair. And if you talk to any of the engineers who were at Neuralink at the time, who are not like Jade and myself, directly involved in the Upscale project, when you talk about Upscale, they think about the job fair. That's the
Yeah.
event to them. They don't recognize the months and months of planning that happened before and the months and months of work that happened after to make it all work. We got a big offsite space. We set it up. It was very festive looking. We had a table for each team, and every team had a big balloon, not like a normal blow it up balloon, but like a 7 times that size balloon with their name written on it.
Yeah.
And they had a signal balloon that was a normal size balloon that was attached to the table. They're all weighted, so they didn't fly away. There's all helium balloons, and that one was brightly colored, and the color didn't really matter. And then the way we ran the job fair was we told everybody when they showed up, here's how it's going to work. So every team's got a table, or rather, every table's got a team. At every team station, there's a little piece of paper in standard format with the name of the team, the list of the stuff that they're going to own, and the list of skills that team needs to be successful.
Yep.
And we had cooked up those skill lists in advance with the designated managers and product managers for that team, right? And so we had that list, and every team manager and PM or TPM was there shilling for their team. They're like trying to recruit engineers. Come work with me. Here's all the cool stuff we're going to do. And the notion was everybody would just walk around and talk to people. And if you're standing at a table, you're on that team. And you can move away from the table if you want to.
Hmm.
And nobody can tell you to move. These were the
Hmm.
rules.
Yeah.
And over the course of the day, as the teams would coalesce, the manager would be looking at their list of required skills and looking at the people and say, do we have anybody who has skill number 1? Raise the hand. Skill number 2, raise the hand. And when they got to the number of people around their table that was able to meet all of the skill needs, doesn't mean that everybody needs all the skills. It means at least one person on the team needs each skill.
Yeah.
So do you have the skills that you need? And do you have roughly the right head count? And we had taken our
Yeah.
head count planning and given a little bit of wiggle room, because if you have it exact numbers, you're never going to get the system to coalesce, right? So we gave ourselves a little wiggle room that way. And so then they would use their signal balloon to indicate to everybody else, here's where we are. So if they had the right number of people and all the skills they needed, they would lower their balloon all the way down to the table.
Yeah.
If they were like close but not quite there, they would leave it halfway. And if they were not there at all, they'd leave it all the way up. So you could
Yeah.
at a glance look across the room and see here are all the teams that are ready to go, and here are the teams that are not ready to go.
Yeah.
We had planned 2 days for this,
Hmm.
and the system almost fully coalesced in the first morning.
Yeah.
So by the end of the first morning, and it was interesting watching it happen. So during that morning, people were moving around. People
Yeah.
were genuinely trying to change their fates. There are several stories. We
Yeah.
had everything from some people who are like, look, I'm one of the 2 mobile devs. I love mobile dev. I'm going to the mobile team.
Yeah.
We had that story, and then we had people who are like, I'm in my second year or third year as an engineer, and this mobile dev thing seems really cool. I'm going to become a mobile engineer. Join the mobile team,
Yeah.
right? So we
Yeah. I
had we
remember
had
that.
everything in between, right? We had a couple people who were like, "You're the rock star. We totally expect you to go to work on the most fancy, like CEO visible, customer visible product." And two of them were like, "Nope, I'm going to go work in site engineering because that's where we've got the biggest problems."
Yeah. I have some
Um,
ideas of how we should change things, and I'm gonna go do those
that's
things there. It
yes,
was
and that's what we wanted, right? We wanted
yeah.
people to be able to communicate to the organization, this is where I'm going to do my best work. Put me
Yeah.
here. And when you have the leaders going into a back room, the VP is going to a back room and deciding for everybody, there's a lot less heartache
Yeah.
because the announcement to the rest of the company is we're having a reorg. Here's what we decided is happening now.
Yeah.
But you can't make the best decisions because you don't know everything. You don't
Yeah.
know that this engineer wants to become a mobile dev. You don't know that this person really wants to go fix those site engineering issues. You can't know that because it's not a natural conversation to have if they're far from that space normally.
Yeah.
But everybody
They
knows where they want to go, right? So this was a real change management moment where instead of doing it to everybody, we did it with everybody.
yeah.
And everybody got to choose where they were going to go. So over the course of the morning, we're watching people move around, we're watching these surprising decisions get made. And we went into lunch with the system almost fully coalesced, almost fully resolved. As I recall, there were just two teams maybe that were in a bad spot.
Mhm.
And those of us on the Upscale team were like sitting here making plans. We're like, how do we deal with this? We can't get it to resolve. And we had this step one is we'll go ask people who we know can solve the problem. Would you mind moving? We're not making
Yeah.
you move, right? Start
Yeah.
there. And then there was backup plan and backup plan and backup plan. And we were gaming it out in the back room over lunch. We like pulled all the sheets with the head counts and the names and everything to be like, can we find a solution here? And in the end, what happened was we did that work and had a very short lunch. And coming back from lunch, our CEO took the podium and he said, essentially, he was so enamored with the way self selection was truly empowering for people and that it was really encouraging people to do their best work that
Mm.
he did not want to force anybody into doing anything they did not want to do. And he's the CEO. And for these two jobs that we can't fill, I'm unlocking money. We're just going to hire them.
Yeah.
And
Which is a great way to do
he
it.
just finished
Yeah.
it. In that moment, we were done. And so
Yeah.
what we had achieved was we took an organization, I think there's about 350 people all in involved.
Mhm. It was like
And
50 teams at that time, maybe
it was 52
55,
teams.
52.
It was
Okay.
52.
Mhm.
And we had 147 engineers self-select that day.
Wow.
So there was still maybe 100 people didn't get to really choose, but we had a whole bunch of people who did. Um, and so then from there, then we made one of our greatest tactical errors of Upscale, the event, which was we're like, okay, now we're going to go into some liftoff activities. And people were so emotionally exhausted from the morning. We should have just said, go bond with your teams. We'll see you tomorrow morning.
Yeah, totally. Because it was I mean, it was emotionally very difficult for a lot of people. I think a lot of people went into that stressed. They felt like the event itself, they
Oh, yeah.
Um, and also a lot of people were choosing based on the people that they liked to work with. I think that was a pretty important part of it too. And so
Yep.
there there was a lot of anxiety around, am I going to get to work with the people I want to work with? What is my job going to be after this day? There was a lot of anxiety going on.
Tremendous amounts of anxiety, and we had to do a lot of work to manage that anxiety going leading up to the event. And then it's a lot like moving day, like you dread it, but at the end of the day you're like, that wasn't so bad. And I feel like that's what
Yeah,
happened. and
totally.
and this is a real lesson for anybody who's thinking about doing a self-selection is it's a great idea and you're gonna have a lot of anxiety and you're
Yeah,
gonna have to manage that very well.
yeah,
And if you can find somebody who's been through it so they can come and talk to people and be like, look, here's what it was like for us. You're going to feel the anxiety.
yeah,
Let me talk to you as somebody who's been through it. You'll get to make your decision. It's going to be okay. You have a job beforehand. You'll have a job afterwards. Your salary's not going to change. You're going to be
yeah,
fine. And in fact, this is a great opportunity for you. You might leverage it to improve your lot, right? We saw people who, as you're saying, were choosing their social connections.
Yeah.
We saw people who were like, I want a specific technology. I want to change the kind of engineering that I do. We also saw people who were being much more sort of mercenary about it and saying, upscale's happening this time of year. If I get on one of the teams that's doing one of the big projects for the conference in October, that is then immediately followed by a review cycle, I will get promoted.
Yeah.
So we had very career minded folks who were doing that strategy. And there is no right strategy. The right
Yeah.
strategy is the one that serves your needs. And we let people choose that for themselves, which I feel is really one of the best wins.
One of the things I thought was really interesting was there were some teams that were not very desirable in some ways, and there were some very experienced engineers that took positions on those teams because they really wanted to mentor and they really wanted to it wasn't glamorous work at all. It was the
Mhm.
opposite, but they like wanted those teams to succeed and they also like they wanted a different role, really. I
Yep.
just thought that was fascinating. Also, I think that they were willing to take one for the company or work in that spot for a while to make it better. But it was really fascinating, all the decisions that went in.
You point out something very important, right? Which is, again, as a manager, how would you have known that?
Never.
So if you're gonna
Yeah.
go into the back room and assign people, that's not the outcome you're gonna get. And so, despite all of the leading anxiety and the cost to the organization, which was non-trivial,
Yeah.
in the lead up to the upscale event, work really slowed down.
Yeah.
And that was really hard for the organization. It was very hard for the business, but ultimately, I believe it was really worth it because coming out of that self selection, everybody was where they wanted to be. And that's not an outcome you can get if you're making decisions on people's behalves. It's an outcome you can only get when they make the decision.
Yeah, and I don't remember the exact numbers of, like, how many people moved, but it was pretty high. I think that remember it was something like half of the people were on basically, like, dissimilar roles or something a third, something like that, and so
Yeah.
there was this period of a couple of weeks after the self-selection event where people were just getting oriented. They were
Mhm.
figuring out the on-call and transitioning and learning,
Yes.
like deciding what their practice of their new teams are gonna be and things like that, and those of us in management were like, "Oh my god, this is, like, so expensive and nothing's happening," and we expected it to take months for the engineering to speed back up, but that was not the case at all. Like, it was like a race had started or something. It was
Oh,
amazing.
completely. Yeah, so we had defined the 2-week transition period, and so it was immediately following that self-selection event. We're like, "We're doing this, we're going now."
Yeah,
And so I think the self-selection was like a Thursday and a Friday, and on Monday, people started on their quote
mm,
new teams. And we had done all the work to figure out the seating chart for where people were even gonna sit, which was hard. And we
yeah,
told people, like, for this transition period, we want you to sit with your new teams, but we still had all the old Slack channels for all the old teams, and
yeah,
people were still on the old on-call schedules.
yeah,
And we're like, during this transition period, which we could not really plan in the details because we didn't know where people were going to move,
yeah,
it's up to you who's leaving your old team to make sure that the people taking over the software that you used to own know what they need to know.
yeah,
And it turns out that's a very easy problem for individuals to solve
yeah,
because they're looking at, I'm leaving one team, I'm joining one team. Great. I have 10 people I have to talk to.
yeah,
And so they were able to figure that out, but we could never have orchestrated that from
yeah,
above. But doing it that way is really easy. And so we told people for 2 weeks, we don't really expect you to be on your new team fully. You're going to be doing all the old work. You
mhm,
may sit with your old team, you may sit with your new team. You just do what you got to do. And by the end of the first transition week, a bunch of the new teams were like, we're done. We're off to the races. Leave us alone. We're trying to get stuff done for the conference. Right.
yeah,
Like they were already working on the next set of priorities. Right. And some of the teams couldn't quite get it done that fast because they owned complicated things or lots of surface area. But by the end of that 2-week period, everybody was done transitioning. It took a little bit longer for some of the on call rotations to really move. We did keep some people on an escalation path for another month or two until the new folks really felt confident. And that was a thing I think we could have done a little bit better planning around, not in the like, how do we make it go way, but in the we really should reward people for doing that extra on call duty kind of
Yeah.
way. But like you said, with people making surprising decisions and choosing to go to quote unsexy teams because they wanted that particular work, what you find is there's a lot of goodwill and people really want to do the right thing for the company. Most
Yeah.
people are good people. This is what I have come to believe. They try to do the best thing that they can. And so it's in hindsight, it's not that surprising that some people are like, yeah, I'll carry the extra on call. It's fine.
Yeah.
That should not surprise us, but it does because I guess we're cynics. Yeah.
Uh,
So we went to that transition period. We got people working on the new stuff, and then we were rolling with the product council and the list of priorities, and people started executing, and they started getting their MMFs done.
yeah.
And that was really exciting. And I think that we benefited from a couple of things to generate that momentum coming out of the change. One was no more anxiety. So that's great. People feel
Yeah.
better, right? Two, everybody chose where they were going to be. So they're happier about where they're at. And
Yeah.
three, with the MMFs, the work got sliced smaller.
Yeah.
And so when you started a thing, it was achievable. It wasn't like a 9-month death march. It was just like, yeah, it's just 2 weeks. I can see my way to the end of this. I can see this future.
Yeah.
And then as they were completing them, they got momentum. And momentum is so critical for teams. And I think we saw that across the org,
Yeah.
where the release of the anxiety, the I'm happy where I am because I chose it, and the momentum just got us all those great results going into October.
The MMFs were, I think, the part that they were the hardest to take in some respects. Like,
Yeah.
some teams really got it and they just ran with it, and the results that they delivered were so obvious that it provided some fuel for other teams to want to adopt it. But it was also something that I think people just really struggled to
Mhm.
think of their work differently, and it took a lot of training, and it became part of our onboarding. I think you were for quite a while, like, training the people and how to break up work incrementally and, like, how to think about
Yeah.
decomposing work. And I guess in my experience, I found that to be just such a powerful change. But that was the one that I feel like it took a lot of kind of follow-up attention.
100%. Yeah. I built out this whole hour in the newbie relics training. I talked about the upscale story. I gave the high level summary of the upscale story and talked about Little's law and queuing theory, and then
Yeah,
talked about MMS. And if you're building the Eiffel Tower, you don't start by building the first leg of the tower. You start by building a 2-inch model.
yeah,
And we have all these great illustrations of like how Agile builds a car. And it's start with a skateboard. That's not how it works. You're not starting with a freaking skateboard. You're
yeah,
not starting with a skateboard then inventing a bicycle. That's not how it works, right?
yeah,
That's a bad analogy. But you do start with a tiny little Eiffel Tower and it looks like the big one. But you don't know enough yet to put a lot of fine detail in it. So you make it really small. And you can show it to people. You're like, hey, designer, does this feel good? Hey, product manager, do you think this meets the market needs? Do we think we got a good thing here? And
yeah,
then every new MF, you make it a little bit bigger and just enhance part of it.
yeah,
And so maybe the next iteration, instead of 2 inches tall, it's 4 inches tall, and you put a little LED light on top.
right.
Oh, do we want a
Or
light
the
on top? No, we don't. We
landscaping
don't.
around it. Yeah,
Yeah, we don't want the
yeah,
light on top. But that's no good. Okay, so next edition, 10 inches tall, and we put some, maybe run some lights up the legs. We're like, oh, we like those lights up legs, but could we make them blue and green? Sure. Next edition, 12 inches tall, lights are blue and green. No, we don't like the blue and green, right?
yeah,
And you get a chance as you iterate to go revisit the old decisions and to move forward, and you're incrementally improving the experience. And eventually you end up with a full size Eiffel Tower. And I really like this analogy because that sort of skateboard to bike to car approach is really coming out of a manufacturing mindset.
yeah,
And software is not manufacturing. So if you're running an assembly line, you're producing cars, it takes a whole bunch of people to produce that car. right?
Yeah.
Lots of teams have to touch the car for it to be done. And the first car rolls off the assembly line, you make 10 grand. Congratulations. The second car rolls off and you make another 10 grand.
Yeah.
The third car, 10 grand. Software is not like that. You ship the feature, you make 10 grand, and then what?
Yeah.
You don't get to ship it a second time. You have to ship a new feature.
Yeah.
You're not shipping cars. When you're building software, you're shipping a factory that makes cars on demand. Customer request
Yeah.
comes in, you're like, here's your car. New request from a new customer. Here's your car. Here's your
Yeah.
car. Here's your car. And then you enhance the car. And next request that comes in, as soon as you do that deploy, here's your car. Now it's got headlights.
Right.
Everybody's very excited for that, for the headlights, right? And that's really what we're doing. And so, because we're not producing the car, we're producing the machine, aka the program that makes the cars. You
Hmm.
can't quite think about it in the manufacturing way. You have to
Yeah.
realize you're producing the machine that makes the things.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. You have to use very different metaphors for software, I think. It's a very
Yes.
different endeavor. Brent, I think I could go on and talk about Upscale with you for an entire day or two. But I just really want to thank you for your time today and look forward to chatting with you soon about this topic or any of the other topics we have to talk about. We didn't even get into team health.
It's been a real pleasure. For me, this was a real watershed moment in my career. It was all the work with Jim Shore that showed me that the way you work is, like everything else humans do, totally arbitrary and subject to change.
Yeah.
And that it's a thing that you can think about, and that there is an art and a science to organizational design and to management. And I never
Yeah.
realized that before, because our culture is steeped in the one single model that we
Yeah.
see everywhere, but is insufficient to all the things that we actually need, and actually goes against most of our better kind of instincts.
Yeah. I think there was so much just wisdom in Jim Shore's approach. Like he clearly had been thinking about these topics for so long that it being a part of Upscale was to be submerged into this whole realm of organizational design and lean product development and so many topics like decision making frameworks and so many different things. It really was. I felt lucky that I was able to be a part of it.
Me too. It really was a masterclass in how leadership works in modern companies.
Yeah.
Like, here are the components, here are the building blocks of being a good leader that you need to think about, because
Yeah.
we were manipulating those building blocks to produce the new system.
Exactly.